The city pulsed with neon and exhaust, its streets still shining from the rain that had passed earlier. The only sound on the nearly empty block was the low buzz of a flickering sign above a corner convenience store. A woman stepped through the glass door, carrying nothing but a bottle of water and the exhaustion of a grueling shift. Before she could reach her car, 6 men spread across the parking lot like a net closing around prey that had not yet realized it was trapped. They laughed. They whistled. One of them stepped forward with a grin stretched across his face. "Come here, sweetheart," he said, his voice soaked in the confidence of a man who had spent years watching people back down. He believed she was nothing more than a lone detective, tired, isolated, and armed with little beyond the badge at her hip. I had no idea that the woman standing before him had survived military deployments that made this parking lot seem almost harmless. He had no idea that her stillness was not fear. It was calculation. Before the confrontation was over, that same man and every one of his companions would be on their knees, begging her to stop, while a security camera captured every second of the lesson the entire city would soon be discussing. Her name was Detective Raina Hollowell. She was a seasoned officer with a past that only a handful of people inside the department truly understood. She moved through the precinct like a shadow, respected by everyone, questioned by almost no one. Her colleagues admired her instincts, the way she read a room before speaking, the way her eyes tracked exits, hands, weapons, and distances without appearing to move at all. They also worried about her. Raina preferred working alone. She disappeared into cases other detectives avoided and followed leads that drew her into the darkest corners of the city. Younger officers whispered about her military record, although none of them had ever heard the full story from Raina herself. There was a stillness in her that unsettled strangers and a quiet warmth that surprised those who earned her trust. She rarely raised her voice. She never needed to. When Raina entered a briefing room, even veteran officers found themselves sitting a little straighter, though few could explain why. Some believed she had served overseas. Others claimed she had trained combat recruits before she ever wore a police badge. No one knew the whole truth, and Raina never offered it freely. To her, the past was a locked door. She opened it only when necessity demanded it. What everyone did know was simple. When Raina Hollowell walked a street after dark, trouble usually noticed her before she acknowledged it. That instinct was about to be tested in a way no one, not even Raina, could have fully anticipated. Her partner during her earliest days on the force, a broad, heavy-set veteran named Everett Maddox, used to tell rookies that working beside Raina felt less like partnering with a detective and more like walking beside a loaded weapon that had learned patience. He meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give, though most young officers needed time to understand what he meant. Everett had since retired, but he still visited the precinct from time to time. Whenever he spoke about Raina, the same quiet reverence entered his voice. He told stories about volatile nights when her composure prevented bloodshed, situations that should have ended in tragedy but did not because she refused to let panic take control. Those stories became something close to legend among the newer officers, repeated in locker rooms and break rooms until no one could fully separate fact from embellishment. What made Raina different, according to those who had worked closest to her, was not simply her skill. It was her restraint. Given her background, she had every reason to lead with force. Instead, she repeatedly chose the opposite. She lowered her voice when others shouted. She calmed terrified witnesses with patience that never seemed to run out. She ended confrontations without feeding the anger that had created them. That restraint made her one of the department's most trusted detectives in volatile situations. Her commanders knew they could place her in rooms where fear, rage, and violence were already gathering, and she would not allow any of them to become contagious. During one evening at the precinct, a report crossed her desk concerning a string of incidents in the South District, an area that had been sinking deeper into neglect for far too long. Store owners were being harassed, delivery drivers were being robbed in broad daylight, residents were refusing to cooperate with police, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were terrified of what might happen after the officers left. A pattern was forming. The pattern pointed toward an organized group calling itself the Iron Kings. Raina read the file twice, then closed it. Her jaw tightened in the quiet way her colleagues had learned to recognize as the moment she made a decision. The Iron Kings had grown increasingly bold, expanding from petty theft into organized extortion and violence. At the center of the group stood Darius Vance, known on the street as Big V, a former boxer who had transformed physical intimidation into a criminal empire. Darius ruled through fear. He had built a reputation for punishing anyone who resisted him, and that reputation had silenced an entire neighborhood. Shop owners paid what the gang called protection money simply to keep their windows intact. Families avoided certain corners after sunset, not because of any official curfew, but because fear had become its own law. Raina began pulling every related case file she could find, cross-referencing addresses, witness statements, vehicle descriptions, and reports that never quite aligned because the people involved were too frightened to speak honestly. A grocery store owner named Marlene Bishop had reported a break-in, only to withdraw every detail when officers tried to follow up. A delivery driver named Diego Navarro had been beaten beside his own truck after refusing to surrender money he did not have. Yet when questioned, he refused to identify the men responsible. Each file told the same story in different language. People had been silenced, not by the law, but by men who believed they answered to no one. The South District had once been a place where neighbors knew one another by name. Porch lights glowed late into the night, and children played in the street until their parents called them home. That version of the neighborhood had slowly disappeared. Boarded windows replaced open storefronts. Metal security gates came down as soon as daylight faded. People moved quickly and avoided eye contact, each person carrying the same unspoken knowledge that some streets belonged to men the law had failed to challenge. Raina remembered the neighborhood as it had once been. She had spent part of her childhood near those streets, though she rarely mentioned it at the precinct. That memory gave every file a personal weight she never discussed. She conducted surveillance from an unmarked car near a laundromat connected to the gang's activity. She watched patiently, noting which vehicles circled the block, which men lingered on corners without purpose, and which storefronts received visitors who entered without buying anything. Patience had always been one of her sharpest tools. She used it now with the same discipline she had once relied upon while waiting out threats in far more dangerous places. Darius believed, as men like him often do, that a badge meant nothing inside territory he considered his own. He had watched patrol cars pass his corners without stopping, either because officers lacked resources or because no one wanted the confrontation. He mistook hesitation for surrender. He openly mocked the department, sometimes standing in full view of passing officers as though daring them to act. His arrogance became armor so thick that he no longer felt the need to look over his shoulder. While Darius grew louder, Raina became quieter. She built the case piece by piece, speaking softly with frightened witnesses and promising protection she intended to provide personally if the department could not. She photographed damaged storefronts. She mapped the pattern of extortion across several city blocks. She recorded names, vehicle plates, payment routes, and every detail that might eventually survive courtroom scrutiny. She did not pursue headlines. She constructed evidence the way a soldier builds a defensive perimeter, methodically, deliberately, and without wasted motion. Before long, word of a persistent female detective reached Darius. One of his men reported that a woman had been asking questions throughout the district, returning even after doors were closed in her face. At first, Darius laughed, assuming she was another officer chasing recognition or a promotion. But the reports continued. His amusement hardened into irritation, and irritation became obsession. Darius decided she needed to become an example. The Iron Kings began watching Raina. They tracked her patrol habits, the places where she stopped for coffee, and the small convenience store she often visited after finishing a difficult shift. Darius wanted to understand her rhythm before making his move, the way a predator studies the path of an animal before stepping into view. His men returned with details that strengthened his belief that she was, in the end, simply another woman who could be frightened into silence. I was wrong. I had no way of understanding how wrong. After an exhausting shift, Raina pulled into the familiar convenience store parking lot. Her body was tired, but her mind continued turning over the evidence connected to the Iron Kings. She stepped inside, purchased a bottle of water, and returned to the night. Only then did she realize the parking lot had changed. 4 vehicles sat at unusual angles near the edges of the property. Men stood near the exits as though their positions had been chosen rather than accidental. By the time the store door closed behind her, the trap had already tightened. 6 men emerged from the darkness with the practiced casualness of people who had intimidated others many times before. Darius stepped forward first. Beside him were Camden, Garrett, Wesley, Nolan, and a wiry younger man named Tyler Reed, whom the others simply called Reed. He seemed eager to prove himself. They spread out across the lot, blocking the path to Raina's car, the side exit, and the alley leading toward the main street. Darius's grin widened as he approached. "Come here, sweetheart," he said again, the mock sweetness in his voice meant to unsettle her. The others laughed and clapped, treating the confrontation like entertainment staged for their amusement. They expected fear. They expected shaking hands, a broken voice, perhaps a plea that would confirm everything Darius believed about power and weakness. Instead, Raina stood perfectly still. Her eyes traveled across the parking lot, not with panic, but with analysis. She noted the security camera above the store entrance. She measured the distance between each man. She identified who stood closest to a weapon and who was positioned nearest an escape route. The night seemed to pause around them. The flickering hum of the neon sign was the only sound cutting through the tension. Darius stepped closer, mistaking her silence for surrender. He had no idea that behind her steady gaze, an entirely different kind of storm was gathering. One built from training that never truly leaves a person, no matter how long it has been since they last wore a combat uniform. The Iron Kings had chosen their target with complete confidence. They were about to learn what that confidence was worth. Darius had planned the confrontation carefully. He wanted it public enough for word to spread through the neighborhood, yet isolated enough that patrol vehicles would be unlikely to interrupt. He believed humiliating the detective in front of people who already feared him would permanently settle the issue. Every detail of the ambush reflected the careless certainty of a man who had never faced meaningful consequences. What he failed to understand was that power built entirely on fear is fragile. It survives only while everyone agrees to remain afraid. Raina had spent years operating in places where fear was the expected response. She had learned that refusing that expectation could mean the difference between survival and disaster. She had faced ambushes far more sophisticated than 6 men in a parking lot. She knew the exact moment when observation needed to become action. That moment was approaching. Darius reached out and placed one hand on her shoulder, a gesture meant to establish dominance in front of his crew. Raina turned her head slowly and looked directly at him. "Take your hand off me," she said, her voice low and even. "This is the only warning you're getting." The words should have stopped him. Instead, Darius laughed harder, glancing toward his men as though inviting them to enjoy the joke. No one in that parking lot had ever heard a woman speak to him with such certainty, the certainty of someone who was not bluffing. Wesley, positioned near the alley, pulled a folding knife from his jacket and opened it with a metallic snap that briefly silenced the laughter. Nolan reached towards the holster at Raina's hip. His fingertips barely touched the leather. Then everything changed. Raina's hand closed around Nolan's wrist before he could reach the weapon. She twisted with controlled speed, using the angle of his own arm to send him crashing onto the pavement with a cry of pain. She pivoted in the same movement. Wesley's knife hand came toward her, but she caught his wrist, redirected the blade, and swept his arm aside. The knife struck the asphalt and skittered beneath a parked car. Camden lunged from her left. Raina's elbow met his jaw with exact, measured force, dropping him before he could finish the attack. There was no wasted movement in anything she did. Every strike landed only where necessary. Every block absorbed force without surrendering position. Every step shifted her body so that the men could not reach her together. Garrett attempted to seize her from behind. Raina lowered her center of gravity, caught his momentum, and threw him over her shoulder into a stack of empty crates beside the store entrance. Reed hesitated. It was only a fraction of uncertainty, but it was enough. Raina drove her forearm into his chest, emptying the air from his lungs and the aggression from his body. He stumbled backward and collapsed against the wall. Darius stood frozen. He watched his men fall one after another, his confidence draining as reality replaced arrogance. He had entered the parking lot certain that numbers guaranteed control. Instead, he watched 5 grown men collapse before he had fully understood that the fight had begun. Each of them learned in the harshest possible way that they had cornered the wrong woman. The full truth about Raina Hollowell was not visible in that parking lot, but its consequences were. Before she became a detective, she had served in the United States Marine Corps. She entered the service as a quiet young woman with a determination that surprised everyone who knew her. She trained in close-quarters combat and learned to read an opponent's intention before the first strike was thrown. She trained for survival under conditions that broke stronger-looking recruits. She learned how exhaustion, fear, and confusion stripped away performance and revealed character. Her deployments placed her in environments where hesitation could cost lives and instinct became more valuable than comfort. She served in urban operations where the line between civilian and threat could shift without warning. She learned to de-escalate whenever possible and to act decisively when restraint alone could no longer protect anyone. She studied how alleys, buildings, open lots, shadows, and sightlines could become either weapons or shields, depending on who understood them first. Her fellow Marines gave her a nickname. They called her the Wall. No matter what came toward her, she did not break. She did not retreat. She did not fall. One of her commanding officers once described her as possessing a rare stillness under pressure, the kind no instructor could simply teach, only forged through repeated contact with chaos until chaos itself became familiar ground. When Raina eventually left the Marines and entered law enforcement, she carried that stillness with her. She folded it beneath the surface of her daily life. She rarely discussed the battles that shaped her and never used them to impress anyone. Her training had taught her to function with little sleep, limited resources, and incomplete information. She learned to assess a room within a breath, identifying exits, weapons, obstacles, and threats before her conscious mind had finished naming them. She learned that panic was a response she could refuse. That refusal had protected her more than once in places far from home. Those lessons had never disappeared. They had simply waited. Under the flickering neon light, Darius saw none of that history. I saw only the result. Raina turned toward him, her breathing steady and her expression unreadable. Something inside him cracked. His pride could not accept defeat in front of the only remaining man who had kept his distance, a thin enforcer everyone called Reed. Darius charged with a wild punch driven by humiliation rather than strategy. Raina stepped aside so smoothly that the strike seemed almost rehearsed. He swung again. She avoided it. His anger deepened with every failed attempt. His shouting echoed across the lot as control slipped further from him. He was no longer thinking, only reacting like a cornered man whose identity depended upon never appearing weak. Raina remained precise. She absorbed his rage without allowing it to infect her. She did not strike from anger. She moved only when movement served a purpose. The difference between them had never been strength alone. It was discipline. Darius had spent his life demanding submission from others. Raina had spent hers learning command over herself. The security camera above the entrance continued recording. Word of the confrontation began spreading through the neighborhood, carried by hurried phone calls and frightened voices from nearby windows. Humiliated and desperate, Darius pulled out his phone and summoned 4 more Iron Kings from a nearby block. Additional vehicles soon entered the parking lot, their headlights cutting hard angles across the wet pavement. 10 gang members had now been drawn into the confrontation, and the new arrivals moved with more caution than the first crew. They had already heard what happened. Raina assessed the shifting situation with the same calm precision. She moved toward a cluster of parked vehicles, using their size to narrow the approach and prevent several attackers from reaching her at once. She positioned herself near the outer edge of the store's light, where she could see clearly while the shadows disrupted her opponent's depth perception. A stack of delivery pallets stood beside the loading area. Raina recognized them as both an obstacle and a potential barrier if the group tried to overwhelm her in the open. As she repositioned, her hand found the radio clipped to her belt. She requested immediate assistance. Her voice was low but urgent, each word clear and necessary. She gave her location and described the threat without panic or wasted explanation. At dispatch, the address was recognized as a location associated with organized gang activity. Units were sent before Raina had finished speaking. The newly arrived Iron Kings spread into a loose formation. They tested the distance between themselves and the detective, watching Darius for direction he could no longer provide with confidence. Reyna used their hesitation. She closed the distance on the nearest attacker before he could commit to a plan and dropped him with a controlled strike that left him gasping against the side of a truck. People were watching now. Faces appeared behind apartment windows. Doors opened a few inches. Residents peered from stairwells and balconies, trying to understand what they were seeing. The confrontation was not about brute strength. It was about geography, timing, and composure. Reyna used the parking lot itself as an ally. Every car, shadow, patch of light, curb, and obstacle became part of her strategy. Darius watched his reinforcements falter. At last, he understood the shape of the mistake he had made. Understanding came too late to undo it. Across the street, an elderly resident named Franklin Ward watched from an upstairs window above the laundromat. He held a phone to his ear and described the scene to his daughter, his voice caught between disbelief and awe. Franklin had lived in the neighborhood for much of his life. He had watched the Iron Kings tighten their grip block by block until their control began to feel permanent. He had stopped expecting anyone in uniform to reverse that decline. What he saw now, a single detective dismantling an entire crew's confidence through discipline and restraint, was so difficult to believe that he called his daughter again to make certain she understood him. His account would travel through the building, then across the block, then through the district. The story would grow with every retelling, but it would never drift far from the truth preserved by the store's security camera. Inside the convenience store, the young clerk watched through the window. His hands trembled, but he found enough courage to call emergency services. He described the fight with a shaking voice, yet provided every important detail investigators would later need. Above him, the security system continued recording from the moment Darius first approached Reyna. Patrol units arrived with lights washing the parking lot in alternating red and blue. Officers secured the scene, handcuffing Iron King's members who could no longer stand quickly enough to flee. Paramedics moved between the injured, treating damage that ranged from bruised pride to broken bones. Reyna stood near the center of the lot, her clothes disordered from the struggle, but her composure intact. She gave the responding sergeant a clear, methodical account. Darius attempted to reshape the story. He claimed Reyna attacked first. He insisted she provoked a peaceful gathering and used unnecessary force against men who had done nothing to threaten her. His version collapsed almost immediately. The store's security footage showed 6 men surrounding one woman. It showed Darius placing his hand on her without permission. It showed a knife opening before Reyna raised a hand. It showed Nolan reaching for her weapon. Most importantly, it showed Reyna refusing to escalate beyond what was required to stop each threat. She struck to disable, not to punish. She restrained rather than retaliated. Even when the circumstances could have justified harsher force, she used only what was necessary. Captured in high definition and impossible to dispute, her restraint transformed the footage from evidence into a lesson in professional conduct under extreme pressure. When Internal Affairs reviewed the incident, concern about the scale of the violence quickly gave way to recognition of how precisely Reyna had handled an ambush that could easily have become fatal. Her commander, Captain Pierce Landry, was a stern man who offered praise sparingly. He watched the recording twice without speaking. Then he turned to the officers around him and said, "This is exactly the kind of detective this department needs." The footage spread through the precinct, carried from desk to desk by officers who could not stop discussing what it showed. But Darius was not yet in custody. During the confusion created by the arrival of patrol units, he slipped through a gap near the back of the lot and disappeared into the dark streets behind the store. His escape changed the nature of the operation. What began as a violent ambush became an active search for the leader of the Iron Kings. Reyna volunteered immediately to join the pursuit. Her request was approved without hesitation. No one knew the case, the gang, or the surrounding streets better than she did. She moved through the district with the same precision that had guided every action in the parking lot. Radio traffic filled the night as units sealed intersections and narrowed the search grid. Reyna anticipated Darius's route through alleys and side streets, using the knowledge she had gathered while building the case. The search drew toward the old warehouse district near the waterfront, a maze of abandoned structures, fenced loading areas, and rusted shipping containers. Darius knew that district intimately. He had grown up running errands there for older gang members before he ever commanded anyone himself. I knew which fences had gaps, which loading docks offered concealment, and which alleys appeared blocked but opened onto service roads. Reyna had studied those same details. She had memorized the geography the Iron Kings depended upon. Darius moved toward the shipping containers near an old pier, believing the darkness and confusion would give him a final route to escape. Reyna cut through a service alley and reached the area before he expected her. Darius climbed a low fence and entered the maze between the containers. He ran until a locked gate ended the path in front of him. Behind him stood the detective he had underestimated from the beginning. The waterfront was almost silent. Loose cables struck metal in the wind. Water moved against the supports beneath the pier. Fog drifted low around the containers, turning every shadow into a possible hiding place. Reyna entered the fog without rushing. Urgency did not control her. She heard Darius's ragged breathing ahead and the scrape of his shoes against gravel as he searched for an exit that did not exist. Cornered and desperate, Darius seized a dock worker who had been finishing his duties nearby. He dragged the startled man against him, gripping his arm in a crude attempt to create leverage. The worker's eyes widened in terror, his hands lifted instinctively. Reyna stopped at an angle that gave her a clear path to intervene without placing the hostage in greater danger. "Release him," she said, "and step away." Her voice carried the same measured calm she had maintained from the beginning. Darius tightened his grip. For a moment, he weighed his shrinking options. Something in Reyna's stance told him the hostage would not protect him. She watched every shift in his shoulders, every movement of his feet, every change in pressure against the worker's arm. Darius shoved the man aside and charged. Reyna was already moving. She closed the distance, redirected his momentum, and brought him to the concrete without reaching for her firearm. Soon Darius lay face down, his wrists secured behind him, every illusion of invincibility finally gone. Backup officers arrived with flashlights sweeping across the containers. They found the Iron King's leader subdued not through gunfire or rage, but through discipline that had defeated him from the first moment he chose to approach the wrong woman. The dock worker was shaken but unharmed. As paramedics examined him, he thanked Reyna repeatedly, his voice trembling with the gratitude of someone who understood how close the encounter had come to ending differently. The case against the Iron Kings began unraveling rapidly after Darius Vance was taken into custody. People who had remained silent under the gang's control finally found their voices. The arrest had stripped away the image of invincibility Darius had spent years constructing, and the security footage gave frightened witnesses something they had never possessed before, proof that the men terrorizing them could be stopped. Marlene Bishop returned to the precinct voluntarily. She gave investigators a detailed account of the extortion and intimidation directed at her grocery store. She described broken windows, threatening visits, and payments demanded under the promise that refusing would bring something worse. Jago Navarro also came forward. He identified the men who had surrounded his delivery truck and beaten him for refusing to surrender money he did not have. Phone records and financial evidence later supported his statement. Detectives working beside Reyna uncovered an extortion system reaching across several neighborhoods. Small business owners had been forced to pay so-called protection fees under constant threat of violence. The investigation also exposed a smuggling operation connected to the waterfront district where Darius had been captured. Stolen merchandise had moved through the port under cover of darkness, then passed through businesses designed to make the transactions appear legitimate. Cold cases that had sat untouched gained new meaning. Several unresolved assaults were linked to members of the same group that had surrounded Reyna in the parking lot. Financial records recovered from a storage unit registered in the name of one of Darius's relatives revealed a level of organization that surprised even experienced investigators. Ledgers documented payments from more than 20 businesses across 3 neighborhoods. Every entry represented a person who had lived under intimidation, sometimes for a long time, without believing anyone could protect them. Bank statements traced part of the money to an auto repair shop that operated as a front for moving stolen goods. The records had been altered well enough to survive a casual review, but not the forensic accounting that followed once investigators gained access to the full operation. Each discovery strengthened a case that was already difficult to challenge. What began as an ambush in a convenience store parking lot became the dismantling of an organized criminal network that had operated openly while convincing an entire district that resistance was useless. Darius now faced charges reaching far beyond the attack on Reyna. Prosecutors connected him to armed robbery, extortion, assault, smuggling, and conspiracy involving organized criminal activity. His attorney attempted to argue that Reyna provoked the confrontation. The security recording made that position impossible to sustain. The footage showed the Iron King surrounding her. It captured Darius touching her after being warned to stop, Wesley opening a knife, and Nolan reaching for her weapon. It showed every movement Reyna made in response. Witness testimony created an even stronger wall around the defense. Prosecutors described the case as one of the clearest organized crime prosecutions their office had handled, built not upon speculation, but upon video evidence, financial records, seized documents, and the testimony of people who had finally found the courage to speak. The trial unfolded through a long sequence of hearings and testimony. Former victims entered the courtroom one after another. Marlene described the fear of closing her store and listening for footsteps outside, never knowing whether a broken window or a violent visitor would follow. Diego spoke about watching men surround his truck, knowing that resistance meant physical punishment, while compliance meant losing money his family needed. Other business owners described the humiliating routine of handing over envelopes simply to be allowed to continue working. Each account added another layer to the evidence. By the time the jury received the case, the possibility of acquittal had nearly disappeared. The verdict confirmed what the evidence had established. The Iron Kings were no longer untouchable. Throughout the media attention, Reyna remained private. She declined most interviews and redirected praise toward the investigators, officers, forensic accountants, and witnesses whose work had turned one confrontation into a complete criminal case. A local reporter eventually approached her outside the precinct and asked how it felt to have taken down so many gang members almost single-handedly. Reyna's answer was characteristically restrained. "This is my job," she said. Then she walked inside. Her refusal to embrace the spotlight only deepened the respect her colleagues already felt for her. They understood what the public was only beginning to see. Reyna had never been chasing recognition. She had been doing the work quietly and consistently long before anyone outside the department noticed the discipline behind it. After Darius's arrest, the South District began changing. The shift was subtle at first. Store owners who had once kept their doors locked during business hours began leaving them open. They greeted customers without repeatedly glancing toward the street. Delivery drivers returned to routes they had avoided. They no longer approached each block expecting confrontation as an unofficial cost of doing business. Community meetings that once drew only a few frightened residents began filling with people discussing repairs, youth programs, business support, and neighborhood safety rather than survival. A cautious optimism moved through streets that had felt abandoned by the institutions responsible for protecting them. Trust did not return all at once. Broken trust rarely does. But the parking lot confrontation had become visible proof that the law could still arrive, hold its ground, and matter, even in a place where many residents had stopped expecting it. Marlene opened her grocery store earlier than she had in a long time. She lifted the security gate without the familiar shaking in her hands. Diego returned to his previous delivery route and waved to shopkeepers who had once avoided eye contact because shared fear made conversation dangerous. Small changes accumulated throughout the district. Each one seemed insignificant alone, yet together they formed the outline of a neighborhood remembering what life felt like without constant dread. The damage was not erased. The direction had changed. That mattered more to the people who lived there than any polished statement from city officials. At the precinct, Captain Landry organized a modest gathering to recognize Reyna's role in dismantling the Iron Kings. There were no cameras and no elaborate speeches, only a room filled with colleagues who understood what she had accomplished and wanted to acknowledge it. Officers raised coffee cups in a quiet toast. Younger recruits watched with the admiration reserved for someone whose reputation had finally been matched by undeniable evidence. Near the edge of the room stood Tessa Vaughn, a young officer still learning what kind of professional she wanted to become. She had heard the stories circulating through the department. She had watched the security recording and found herself inspired and intimidated in equal measure. After most of the gathering had dispersed, Tessa approached Reyna. A question had remained in her mind since the first time she saw the footage. "What makes you not afraid?" she asked. Reyna considered the question. Her expression softened. She thought about military training, about hostile deployments, about nights when fear and duty collided and only one could determine what happened next. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," she said. "It's doing what is right, even while you feel it." The words settled quietly across the room. They were not delivered as a speech or a slogan. They were simply a truth passed from one officer to another. Tessa nodded and stored the lessons somewhere deep, among the principles that would guide her when her own difficult moments arrived. As the gathering ended, Reyna left the precinct and returned to her vehicle. The city stretched ahead in its familiar pattern of light and shadow. The South District looked different now, not because the buildings had changed, but because the air no longer carried exactly the same weight. The neighborhood seemed to be breathing more freely after holding its breath for far too long. Reyna drove past the convenience store where the confrontation began. The same neon sign buzzed above the entrance. The parking lot beneath it was quiet and empty. Her radio came alive with details of another call elsewhere in the city. Reyna reached for the switch that activated her lights. There was no hesitation and no desire to remain inside the story everyone else was telling about her. There was only readiness. Red and blue reflections moved across the dark storefronts as she turned back onto the road. Somewhere ahead, another person was waiting for help, unaware that the detective responding carried the discipline of a Marine and the steady heart of someone who had decided long ago that fear would never be allowed to choose for her. The city absorbed her vehicle into its glowing maze of streets until the lights disappeared into the distance. The Iron King's case eventually moved through the courts, and Darius Vance's name became part of the department's record of dismantled criminal organizations. Yet the story of the parking lot continued circulating among officers and residents. Inside the precinct, it became something close to folklore, not because of the violence, but because of the discipline the footage revealed. New recruits heard some version of the story during training, especially in conversations about composure, restraint, and decision-making under pressure. Reyna rarely discussed it unless asked directly. She preferred to focus on the cases still waiting and the neighborhoods that continued to require the same patient attention she had shown from the beginning. She understood better than most people that public recognition changed very little about the work itself. The badge still carried the same responsibility. The streets still needed someone willing to walk them without surrendering to fear. What changed was the community's understanding of the woman who had been quietly serving among them. They had watched, through security footage and stories carried from door to door, a detective refuse intimidation. They saw her transform an encounter intended to humiliate her into a demonstration of training, restraint, and unshakable resolve. The Iron Kings believed they had selected an easy target, a lone woman trapped between 6 men and the cruelty they had grown accustomed to inflicting. Instead, they chose the wrong former Marine. That mistake followed every one of them into the legal consequences that continued long after the parking lot grew quiet. And across the city, night after night, Detective Reyna Hollowell kept driving toward the darkness. For her, courage had never meant living without fear. It meant arriving anyway. Again and again, for every person still waiting for someone willing to answer the call.